The first time my mother asked me to apologize for getting promoted, she said it like she was asking me to pass the salt. We were sitting in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon while she cut tomatoes for salad, and I stood near the counter answering work emails, and she glanced over and said, "You know your sister cried after dinner yesterday." I immediately looked up because I assumed something serious had happened. A breakup, money problems, something medical. So I asked why, and she shrugged and said, "She feels like you look down on everyone now." I actually laughed, because I genuinely thought she was joking. She didn't laugh back. That was the moment something shifted in how I understood my family, because until then I still believed the tension was temporary, that people just needed time to adjust after the promotion, that eventually everything would settle back into whatever we had before. Instead, it kept getting worse, in ways I hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain, because nothing about my actual behavior had changed. I work in shipping logistics, vessel operations for a private transport company near the port. The job sounds boring when you explain it to people outside the industry, but if something goes wrong, everybody remembers your number at 3 in the morning. For almost 9 years, I basically lived inside stress. Night calls, emergency schedule changes, broken documentation, customs delays, crew problems, weather problems, managers screaming across time zones because somebody in another country forgot to send one critical document. There were stretches where I barely slept for days. I missed birthdays, canceled trips, spent Christmas answering calls from captains losing their minds in bad weather somewhere in the Atlantic. My family treated all of it like I worked at a random office pressing buttons. Especially my sister Vanessa, who had always called my work fake stressful, her exact phrase, while cycling through 4 different career experiments in 6 years. Real estate, cosmetics, online coaching, and a jewelry business that lasted roughly 2 months before she started posting cryptic Instagram content about toxic people draining entrepreneurs. My mother defended every pivot as finding herself. If I was too exhausted to answer the family group chat for a few hours, I was selfish. That was the balance inside our family. Vanessa was sensitive, I was stable, and stable people apparently didn't get to have needs. The promotion came in February. Our regional director retired unexpectedly and management restructured departments. I didn't even apply at first because I assumed they had someone else in mind. Then one Friday my boss called me into his actual office, not a conference room, not HR, and when I sat down and he closed the door behind him, my first thought was that something had gone wrong. Instead, he smiled and asked why he liked working with me. I said probably because I answered my phone like a hostage negotiator. He laughed harder than I expected and said no, because everybody else panics and I don't. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, management authority, travel opportunities, and performance bonuses, but the thing that affected me most wasn't the money. It was the feeling that the years had actually meant something, that someone had looked at my exhaustion and called it valuable instead of just expected. I made the mistake of telling my family too early. At first, everybody acted supportive. My uncle clapped my shoulder, my aunt hugged me. Vanessa smiled and said, "Look at you becoming corporate." That lasted roughly 48 hours before the comments started. Small ones, always framed as jokes. "Oh wow, Mr. Manager is too busy to answer now. Careful, soon he'll stop talking to poor people. Guess you're paying next time." Always with that particular laugh afterward that signals you're overreacting if you get annoyed. I didn't take it seriously at first because I had spent my whole life watching this family use humor as a delivery mechanism for things they actually meant, and I had learned a long time ago that calling it out directly made you the difficult one. The first moment that genuinely bothered me came during dinner at my mother's apartment about 2 weeks after the news. Vanessa was talking about some business course she wanted to buy online. Something expensive, taught by a woman whose entire brand seemed to involve being photographed next to rented Lamborghinis. My mother looked at me and said I should help her, and I assumed she meant advice. So I said I thought Vanessa should be careful because most of those courses were essentially content repackaged as transformation. Vanessa immediately rolled her eyes and said, "See, this is what I mean." And when I asked what she meant, she said I always acted like I knew everything now. I told her I had literally just said be careful. She said exactly. I talked to everybody like I was above them. The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when everyone already knows the shape of what's coming and has decided to let it land without interfering. My uncle stared at his plate. My aunt became fascinated by bread. My mother sighed and said Vanessa was just sensitive lately, and I should let it go. That became the house rule. Vanessa could say whatever she needed to say, and I was expected to absorb it, because reacting made me the aggressor. I watched that dynamic operate over the following weeks and understood it more clearly each time. Not because I was particularly perceptive, but because it happened so consistently that even I couldn't explain it away anymore. About a month after the promotion, I bought a different car. Nothing dramatic. Used, reliable, a few years newer than my previous one. I parked outside my mother's building one evening and walked upstairs with groceries, and the second Vanessa looked out the window and saw it, her mood changed. She said, "You bought that?" And when I said it was just a car, she laughed once with nothing behind it and said, "Must be nice." I ignored the tone. Then during dinner she made comments every 10 minutes about the rich people car, about management fees, about how money changed everybody eventually. I finally asked what her problem was, and my mother immediately redirected. Why was I getting defensive? That question became a recurring structure over the months that followed. It didn't matter what happened. The second I acknowledged the behavior, my reaction became the subject, and the original behavior disappeared. Then came the restaurant, which was when I stopped explaining things as random jealousy and started understanding that something more organized was happening. We went out for my cousin's birthday at a place near the marina. Not extravagant, but expensive enough that people checked prices before ordering. The second the menus arrived, something changed in the atmosphere. People kept glancing at me, not directly, just enough that I noticed. My uncle made a joke about ordering desserts now that the manager was there. My aunt added something about an executive budget. Then the entire dinner became a performance where people ordered freely while making small jokes about my salary. And Vanessa ordered the most expensive cocktail twice despite normally complaining about spending money on coffee. When the bill arrived, nobody reached for it. Not even the polite gesture of reaching. They all looked at me and waited, with the stillness of people who have already made a decision and are just letting the scene catch up to it. I asked if we were splitting, and the silence afterward felt physical. My mother leaned over and said quietly that everyone was struggling right now. I looked around the table at my uncle who had posted vacation photos from Greece 3 days earlier, my cousin wearing a watch worth more than my rent, and Vanessa, who spent half her life ordering delivery and photographing shopping hauls. I paid anyway because I didn't want a scene in public. The entire drive home, I felt used in a way I didn't have the right language for yet. Not angry exactly, just aware that something had crossed into territory it wasn't supposed to cross. After that dinner, paying became expected rather than appreciated. Once people start feeling entitled to your success, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a resource, a walking solution to their frustrations, a symbol of everything they've decided life unfairly withheld from them. I understood that intellectually before I understood it about myself. I found out my mother had been talking about me behind my back completely by accident at Easter dinner at my uncle's house, because my aunt got drunk and forgot to keep the story organized. By then, almost 4 months had passed since the promotion, and every family gathering had started feeling like psychological warfare disguised as small talk. No matter what I said, somebody reinterpreted it as arrogance. If I mentioned being tired, someone said it must be hard counting all that money. If I declined an invitation because of work, I was too important now. If I stayed quiet, I was judging everybody. I had started dreading these gatherings before they happened, not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I was exhausted by constantly defending normal behavior to people who had decided in advance what it meant. Easter dinners started the way they all started. Too much food, too much alcohol, everyone pretending everything was fine. Vanessa arrived late wearing designer sunglasses indoors. My mother immediately praised her outfit, and I walked in carrying 2 bottles of wine and got hit with, "Look who finally had time for family." I had adopted a strategy by then of simply not reacting to anything, which I later understood made them angrier, because people who run on emotional reactions genuinely hate when you stop providing them. Things were manageable until my uncle asked about work and I mentioned I might travel for a conference later in the year. Vanessa laughed under her breath and said, "Of course." And when I asked what that meant, she said, "Nothing," while smiling into her drink, and I let it pass because I had learned that responding made me the problem. Then my aunt, several glasses in, leaned over and said my mother worried about me. I asked why. She said my mother thought success was changing me. The whole table went quiet in that specific, uncomfortable way. Not shocked, just the discomfort of someone saying out loud what was only supposed to exist as subtext. I looked directly at my mother. She said she never said that. My aunt said yes you did. My mother said not like that. My aunt said you literally told me you don't recognize him anymore. And right there, something settled into place in my understanding of the previous months, because suddenly all of it, the comments, the coordinated guilt, the way tension always seemed freshly stoked whenever I arrived anywhere, started connecting into something deliberate rather than coincidental. My mother noticed me staring and switched immediately into a mode I had watched her use my entire life, where she became the injured party so fast and so completely that the room reorganized itself around her injury before anyone processed what had actually happened. She said quietly that she guessed she wasn't allowed to worry about her own son. I asked why she was telling people I had changed. She said she didn't say changed. I said she had just admitted she didn't recognize me. She said I acted different. Vanessa jumped in and agreed. I asked different how, and neither of them could answer concretely, which was the tell, because I was still visiting, still helping financially, still showing up, still answering calls at unreasonable hours. The only thing that had actually changed was that I had stopped apologizing for the parts of my life that were going well, and apparently that was the thing that had to stop. My mother finally said I was colder. That irritated me more than the other accusations, not because it was unfair on its own, but because it ignored the obvious reason. Of course, the temperature had changed. Every interaction for months had been criticism, every achievement recast as a personality flaw, every purchase treated as evidence of something wrong. I asked out loud what exactly I was supposed to feel warmly toward, and she looked genuinely shocked, then hurt, then offended, in that sequence that had become so reliable I could have set a clock to it. She said that ever since the promotion, everyone walked on eggshells around me. I stared at her, because I had spent 4 months being treated like a criminal for owning a newer car, and somehow inside our family's framework, I was still the one creating the atmosphere. I left early that night. My mother texted 20 minutes later. You embarrassed me tonight. Not are you okay, not we should talk, just the image problem, the social cost, the optics. I sat at a red light staring at the message and felt something in me start changing. Not rage. Something quieter and more permanent than rage. Like the part of me that kept trying to earn approval that moved every time I got close to it had simply gotten tired and sat down. Things escalated after that. Vanessa started making comments publicly, reposting quotes on social media about people forgetting where they came from, money revealing character, someone getting promoted once and thinking they're royalty. No names, but everyone knew, because family gossip travels faster than anything, and her followers included half our relatives. I started hearing things secondhand. Apparently I was showing off. Apparently I thought I was too good for everybody. Apparently I was obsessed with status. My actual daily life was waking up exhausted, handling work emergencies, drinking too much coffee, trying not to burn out, going home, sleeping badly, and repeating it. Not a luxury fantasy. Just finally making decent money after years of destroying my nervous system in a job everyone called fake stressful. The apartment was what pushed everything into genuinely insane territory. My lease was ending and I moved somewhere closer to the port, smaller commute, safer neighborhood, modern building. Nothing extravagant, just a place that didn't have mold in the bathroom or pipes that sounded possessed every winter. When my mother visited for the first time, she walked through in complete silence, opening cabinets, looking at furniture, conducting a slow inspection. Then she sat down and said she didn't understand why I needed all this. I asked what she meant by all this. She said this lifestyle. The word almost made me laugh, because the apartment wasn't luxury. It was just clean, and apparently clean had become morally suspicious. I said I worked a lot and wanted somewhere decent. She said I had never cared about these things before, and I didn't say out loud that before I couldn't afford them, because I already knew how any defense would land. Then she told me Vanessa had cried when she saw the place. I asked what that had to do with me. She said my sister felt behind in life. I said I couldn't seriously be blamed for renting an apartment. She said she wasn't blaming me. She was just saying maybe I could be more aware of how my success affected people. That sentence sat in the room like something toxic, because underneath the careful wording was a clear request. Shrink yourself, dim things down, act smaller, pretend things aren't improving so other people feel comfortable standing next to you. I had learned that lesson early. I remembered being 16 and getting quietly corrected for scoring higher than Vanessa on exams because she was already insecure. I remembered learning to hide achievements because attention created problems. What I hadn't understood until that afternoon, sitting in my own apartment watching my mother criticize my kitchen cabinets, was that none of this was about the promotion. The promotion had just removed the financial circumstances that made shrinking easier. The expectation had always been there. Then she said something that pushed it past the point of arguing. She said there was still time to step back a little, that I didn't always have to keep climbing. I asked what that meant. She looked away and said I didn't always have to keep pushing professionally. She sounded completely sincere, which was the part that took me a moment to absorb. She was genuinely, earnestly suggesting I slow down my career because my success was making the family uncomfortable. Not hinting at it, saying it. After that conversation, I stopped telling my family anything about my life. No work updates, no plans, no purchases. I treated every interaction like an exchange where information could become ammunition later, and things became quieter, though not better, just less openly hostile. I want to be honest about that period because it would be easy to frame it as peaceful, but it wasn't. It was the kind of quiet that comes from two sides retreating rather than from anything being resolved, and I felt the weight of it differently than I expected. I had grown up inside that family's noise and criticism, and even when the noise was harmful, its absence left a strange gap. I caught myself at family dinners performing a version of myself that revealed nothing, answering questions with enough to satisfy the surface without giving anyone material to work with, and I recognized that I was managing them the same way I managed difficult counterparts at work, which told me something about where things had actually arrived, even if I wasn't ready to say it plainly yet. Meanwhile, at work, my life was moving in the opposite direction. The company sent me to Rotterdam for a logistics conference that summer, and I remember standing near the harbor one evening after the meetings ended, watching ships move through the water under orange light, and realizing that I felt more genuinely respected by people who had known me for 3 days than by relatives who had known me my entire life. Nobody there cared about my car or my apartment or whether my success was making someone at home feel behind. They cared whether I solved problems cleanly and showed up prepared and could be trusted under pressure. That was the whole metric. Competence and reliability, which were exactly the things I had been told my entire life were fine, but somehow also offensive to everyone around me. I made the mistake of posting one photo from the trip, just a harbor view with the caption, "Long week." Vanessa reposted a quote within the hour about people who confuse business trips with personality traits. My cousin commented on the photo with something about not forgetting the little people, with a laughing emoji that was doing a lot of work. My mother texted privately to say my sister was upset again. I stared at the screen in my hotel room and felt my patience for the entire system starting to rot from the inside, slowly and without drama, like something that had been wet for too long. The engagement dinner for my cousin Andre was probably the real turning point, though I didn't understand that until afterward. I walked in and the atmosphere was already off, too quiet, too polite, the specific politeness that precedes something being said. Vanessa barely acknowledged me. My mother hugged me without warmth. Even my aunt looked tense. I considered leaving immediately and didn't, which I still think about, because some part of me kept believing that enough patience would eventually fix something that had nothing to do with my patience. Dinner dragged on. Eventually, the conversation moved to money and work because apparently my family could not survive one gathering without dissecting my career, and Vanessa sighed and said at least somebody had escaped the struggle. Nobody responded, because that kind of comment lives in the silence around it rather than in any answer. I finally said, could we stop acting like I had robbed a bank? And Vanessa said no one had said that, and I said they had all been treating me strangely for months. My mother immediately said, why did everything have to become an attack with me lately? Which was the distillation of the entire dynamic. They could say whatever they wanted, and my acknowledging it meant I was creating drama. I said something I had been holding back for months, probably longer than I should have. I said that I had spent years helping everyone at that table financially and emotionally, and somehow the moment my own life improved, they all acted like I had betrayed them. Nobody answered. So I kept going, and I said Vanessa's rent, paid twice, and her face changed in a way I hadn't intended. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific look of someone whose private accounting has been read out loud. My mother snapped that this was not the time, and I said it was apparently always time to criticize me. And Vanessa folded her arms and said she never asked me to hold that over her head. I almost laughed, because people love accepting help right until the moment gratitude becomes uncomfortable. Then my mother started crying. Not subtle tears, a full emotional production, the kind that immediately reorganizes any room around her distress regardless of what had been happening before. My aunt started rubbing her shoulder. My cousin's face turned toward me with something resembling accusation. And I stood there genuinely uncertain how defending myself had become the thing that required comforting, how the conversation had rotated 180 degrees without anyone appearing to notice. She said through it that I used to care about people more before the promotion. I stared at her. The accusation was insane on its face. I was still there, still helping, still showing up, but she said it like it was simply true, like she had been holding it patiently and had finally found the right moment. I asked quietly what she actually wanted from me. Vanessa muttered that I could stop acting superior. And I understood then that they had emotionally translated my progress into arrogance so completely that the translation had become the reality they lived inside. My success hadn't changed me into someone who thought he was better than everyone. They had decided it had, and then responded to the decision as though it were a fact. I looked directly at my mother and asked if she actually resented me for doing well. Her expression changed. Not guilty, but caught, which is different, because caught means she knew the honest answer would sound horrifying and was calculating something else. She said I was twisting her words. I said I was finally understanding them. The room went quiet in the way it had gone quiet many times before, except this time I didn't feel the urge to soften what I'd said or find a way to make everyone comfortable again. Then she said the thing that I still replay sometimes. She sighed and said I didn't understand what it felt like when one person's success made everyone else feel small. And there it finally was, the actual truth. After almost a year of circular arguments and vague accusations and emotional performances, not concern, not worry, not fear that I had changed. My success made them feel small, and instead of sitting with that feeling as their own to work through, they had decided I was responsible for managing it. I said something about that being an insane thing to say out loud, and she said I was taking everything the wrong way. Then she said maybe the promotion had been too much too fast, and I asked if she was serious, and she said maybe there were more important things than status. Status. She reduced 9 years of sleep deprivation and stress and sacrifice to the word status, like I had climbed professionally, because I wanted to feel impressive rather than because I wanted to stop being afraid of my bank account every month. I stood up. My uncle said, "Don't leave angry." I told him honestly that I wasn't angry, which surprised me when I said it because it was true. Anger still wants something: resolution, acknowledgement, repair. What I felt was different, quieter, more like conclusion than emotion. I told my mother I hadn't chosen work over family, and that she hadn't lost me to a promotion. I said I chose peace over constant punishment, and I walked out while she was still crying. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't turn around to check if everyone was okay. Nobody contacted me for 3 days after that, which felt strange at first. The sudden absence of a noise I had been living inside so long I'd stopped hearing it as noise. Then slowly something unexpected happened. I relaxed. Actually relaxed, in a way I hadn't in months. My phone buzzing stopped filling me with preemptive dread. I went to work, came home, slept properly for the first time in what felt like a long time, and the terrifying part was realizing how abnormal my family had made normality feel. My mother called on the 4th day. She opened without greeting by saying I had really hurt everybody, and when I asked by doing what exactly, she said I had humiliated her. I asked if she heard herself, and she said I was still doing it, talking down to people, and I understood then that we had arrived at the version of the conversation we were probably always going to end up in, where basic disagreement reads as superiority, where saying anything clearly sounds like condescension to someone who has decided in advance that's what it is. She tried several other approaches over the next 20 minutes. Guilt about history, sacrifice, motherhood, the classics. When she got to "after everything I've done for you," I interrupted and said something that I think landed honestly, which was that she was treating raising me like an investment that hadn't returned what she expected emotionally, and she said that was a cruel thing to say, and I said I thought it was true. She said I was angry. I said I was finally paying attention. The conversation ended without resolution because you cannot resolve problems with people who need the problem to exist in order to maintain a certain kind of control. I stopped reaching out after that. Not dramatically. I didn't announce anything, didn't post about boundaries online, didn't perform the exit. I just stopped initiating. No more errands, no more quietly paying things, no more absorbing friction that nobody acknowledged. And almost immediately the system started showing its seams, because once the person who was holding things together stops, everyone discovers how much invisible weight he was carrying. I want to be honest that this period wasn't triumphant. There were nights where I went through the whole thing again in my head and couldn't fully convince myself I hadn't made it worse somewhere. There was a week where I almost called my mother just to hear a normal conversation. Except I couldn't remember what a normal conversation with her sounded like anymore and realized I might be remembering something that had never quite existed. I thought about Vanessa sometimes and felt something complicated that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't entirely free of it either. She had her own history, her own version of growing up inside that family's framework, and whatever she had become was at least partly the shape that the same pressure had made of her. That didn't excuse the behavior, but it made the whole thing feel less like a story about a villain and more like a story about what happens when people are never asked to sit with their own discomfort and develop some tolerance for it. Vanessa called about 2 weeks after the dinner, not to address what had happened but to ask for money. A single text, no preamble, no acknowledgement of the months of behavior before it, just a request framed as urgent. I replied with one word and she called immediately and said, "So that's it? You think you're too good for family now?" And then said my problem was thinking money made me important, which was a remarkable thing to say to someone you were actively trying to extract money from during the same phone call. I asked her, calmly, if I was such a terrible person, why she kept coming to me for help. A short silence, long enough that I knew she'd heard the question, and then anger, and then she hung up. That was the last real conversation we had for a long time. The family did what families do: gossip, reputation management, the soft rewriting of events into a version where I had simply become difficult and distant for reasons nobody could quite articulate. I heard secondhand that I was arrogant, brainwashed by corporate culture, emotionally unavailable, obsessed with status. Nobody in those conversations said we made him feel guilty for succeeding, because saying it out loud would have required hearing how it sounded. Instead, it got softened into me distancing myself, as though distance were something I had chosen arbitrarily rather than something I had arrived at after a year of trying everything else. My uncle called a few months later and said, somewhat awkwardly, that he thought my mother had gotten scared. I asked of what. He hesitated and said he thought she was scared I wouldn't need the family anymore. That sentence stayed with me longer than any of the arguments had, because underneath all the manipulation and the jealousy and the coordinated guilt was something sadder and more human than any of it. Control dressed up as love for so long and so consistently that probably nobody inside it could tell the difference anymore. My family didn't know how to love someone they couldn't manage emotionally, and success had made me harder to manage, harder to guilt, harder to shame, harder to keep in a shape that felt safe and familiar. I don't think my mother sat down one day and decided to be this way. I think she had learned it somewhere earlier, from people who had loved her the same way, and had passed it along without knowing it was something that could be done differently. My mother and I met once more, about 8 months after the engagement dinner, at a cafe on a quiet street not far from where we used to get coffee when I was in my 20s and things between us were simpler. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, that specific tiredness of someone who has been maintaining a version of events for a long time and is running low on the energy it takes. We ordered, we talked about peripheral things, and I noticed she was being careful in a way she hadn't been before, measuring things before she said them, which was both strange and a little sad because carefulness had never been part of how we talked to each other. After about half an hour, she asked whether my career had really been worth losing the family over. I sat with that question for a moment before answering because I didn't want to say something reflexive. I wanted to say something accurate. I told her I hadn't lost the family over a promotion. I told her I had lost them the moment they decided my success offended them more than my pain had ever mattered. She said that wasn't fair, that she had always cared about my pain. I said I believed she thought that was true. She asked what the difference was. I said the difference was whether it showed in what she did, not in what she intended. She looked away after that, out the window at the street, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she had never meant for it to feel the way it had felt, and I believe that too. I think she genuinely hadn't meant it, the same way people generally don't mean the patterns they run on, because patterns aren't chosen consciously. They're just what happens when nobody stops to examine them. I didn't tell her that. I just said I knew, and we sat there for a while longer. And when we left, we hugged briefly at the door in the way of people who are still working out what they are to each other. I walked to my car and sat in it for a few minutes before driving. Not because I was upset exactly, more because it takes a moment to settle after something that has been unresolved for a long time finally becomes simply unresolved in a quieter way. We didn't repair things after that meeting, and I've stopped expecting that we will in the way I used to mean when I thought about repair. I talk to my mother occasionally. The conversations are shorter than they used to be, more careful on both sides, and I don't know if that's permanent or just where we are while things are still finding their shape. I think about Vanessa sometimes and wonder how she's doing in a way that doesn't have anger in it anymore, which surprised me when I first noticed it. My uncle and I speak more easily than before, probably because he was never the one driving any of it. Life continued, in the ordinary way that life continues whether or not you've resolved anything, and I continued with it. What I know now is that I made the right decisions, and also that making the right decisions doesn't guarantee they feel the way you expected. It didn't feel like freedom exactly, or at least not immediately. It felt more like the particular exhaustion of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and finally putting it down, and then standing there for a while not quite knowing what to do with your hands. The clarity came slowly rather than all at once. I stopped apologizing for the years behind the promotion. I stopped performing smallness so that other people could feel comfortable standing next to me. I stopped treating their discomfort with my progress as evidence that something was wrong with my progress. Those things didn't happen in a single moment at a dinner table or in a hotel room in Rotterdam. They accumulated, the same way the damage had accumulated, gradually and then more quickly, until one day the weight of one was clearly less than the weight of the other. The strangest thing, sitting with all of it now, is realizing I was never actually difficult to love. I had just spent long enough surrounded by people who confused control with love that I had stopped being able to tell them apart.